Hello and welcome to EBRD's COVID-19 Resilience Framework Environmental and Social Assessment Training Programme. This is Video 1, Power Generation. My name is Stuart Hume from a company called Environmental and Social Advisory Services, or ESAS. I'm a social specialist with 23 years experience covering 39 countries. For the purpose of this video, I'm joined by a colleague, Jo Truick. Jo, please introduce yourself.
Hi everyone, my name's Jo Truick. I'm an ecologist. I've been running a consulting company for 25 years and I focus on compliance with international performance standards, and I also design and conduct ecological assessments for large infrastructure projects.
Thank you, Jo. So the purpose of this training video is to illustrate how EBRD's environmental and social policy and the accompanying performance requirements can be applied during an environmental and social assessment of a project within the power generation sector. And the example used for this video is the construction and operation of a new wind farm. Let's now introduce the project. So we have some key facts. So there are 30 onshore wind turbine generators providing up to 110 megawatts of power. There's a 25-kilometre overhead transmission line. There's a construction camp for the workforce, a future control room and substation linking the energy to the national grid. There's a variety of existing earth tracks which will be upgraded into paved roads, which will also be available for public use. And of course, there will be the turbines themselves. And as you can see from the photo, they are positioned on mountain peaks, highly visible, and will be covered in snow during winter periods. So the first step is to explore which of EBRD's performance requirements apply to this specific case study. So PR1, assessment and management of environmental and social risks and impacts. Well, PR1 always applies. In this case, it was a category A project, and a detailed environmental and social assessment was completed due to the scale and the magnitude of the project, particularly in relation to the significant changes in landscape and visual setting that are expected to occur. PR2, labour and working conditions. Well, PR2 applies as well due to the presence of a workforce and the use of multiple primary suppliers to provide a range of goods and services, and also from the use of a construction camp for the workforce. Now, given there are so many different companies involved during the construction of this project, contractor management is certainly a key issue to be investigated across all of the relevant PRs. PR3, resource efficiency and pollution prevention and control. Well, PR3 applies as well. The project during construction will use a variety of resources, water, materials, fuels, and aggregate during the construction. But there's also a potential impact to mountain springs and the generation of noise and shadow flicker impacts during operations of the turbines. And we'll explore some of the PR3 issues in this training video. So PR4, health, safety and security. Well, PR4 also applies from the use of road vehicles, the generation of hazards to the workforce and local communities during construction, including the requirement for multiple heavy lifts to take place during construction of the wind turbine components, but also due to the potential for ice throw to occur during winter operations, which is a community health and safety risk. PR5, land acquisition, restrictions on land use and involuntary resettlement. Well, PR5 applies as well. So the land required for the individual turbine foundations will be leased from private individuals. The land for the existing access roads that are to be upgraded is owned by the state. The land surrounding the turbines, the broader project area, is informally used by animal herders and local people for grazing and also for the collection of a variety of forestry products. So PR5 applies as well. So Joe, in relation to PR6, please tell us why PR6 applies to this specific project.
There are several biodiversity features present that could be affected by different components of the project, which are listed on the IUCN Red List of threatened species and could trigger the presence of critical habitat. The project is also located near an important bird area and affects some plants which are listed on the National Red List.
Thank you, Joe. So moving on to PR7, Indigenous peoples. Well, PR7 doesn't apply because there are no people in the project area that meet the PR7 applicability criteria. PR8, cultural heritage. Well, PR8 does apply due to the significant excavations required and earth movements during installation of the turbines, and also potentially the disturbance of ground during the upgrades of the existing access roads. And PR10, well, PR10, information disclosure and stakeholder engagement, always applies. And in this project, a comprehensive public disclosure and consultation process was undertaken. There was significant interest in the project due to the visual impact, but also the expectation of local employment and community development projects from the project developer. And indeed, looking across the stakeholder engagement records, we can also see various queries associated with land access and also the potential for ice throw to take place. So in relation to the project, we will now explore the application of PR5 and PR8. So if we look at the photos on the slide, we can see on the left that the project area is used informally for the grazing of livestock and the collection of natural resources. And on the right is an example of a mountain spring. So there are many mountain springs present across the project area, which are used by local herders for their livestock. There's also a variety of bats and birds present as well in some caves, and we'll come on to that in a minute. So the training video is structured around the three central tasks of the environmental and social assessment. So let's now look into task 1, review of existing documentation. So under task 1, a variety of information was requested from the client. So in relation to PR5, land acquisition, restrictions on land use and involuntary resettlement, a copy of the Environmental and Social Impact Assessment Report was requested to investigate the way in which impacts had been identified and assessed as part of the project's permitting process. All land acquisition and resettlement planning documentation was also requested to investigate the current status of land acquisition and to see the way in which stakeholder engagement had been undertaken in parallel with the land acquisition process. And details of the project's grievance mechanism and copies of the latest grievance register was also requested to explore whether or not any group or individual had raised a grievance against the project. Joe, please tell us about PR6 and the information requested from the client.
Thanks, Stuart. So because of the potential location of the project within critical habitat, and because the project could also potentially affect features that would constitute priority biodiversity features under PR6, we would anticipate that a comprehensive biodiversity baseline survey would have been done. So we request the biodiversity baseline survey reports and any specific technical studies that were done as part of the baseline development. We would also anticipate that a critical habitat assessment had been done, and therefore we would request the critical habitat assessment report. In this case, because of the presence of bird and bat species that might be sensitive to collisions with wind turbines and also potentially with road traffic, we requested a copy of the collision risk model, which would look at the sensitivity of bird and bat species in particular and their vulnerability to collisions with wind turbines. We would also anticipate that the client would have developed bird and bat monitoring reports and any other monitoring reports or frameworks that might be needed for critical habitat features. And finally, before any development takes place, the client should have a biodiversity action plan in place, particularly if there are potential impacts on critical habitat. So we would request the copy of the biodiversity action plan and also potentially any additional biodiversity monitoring plan that the client might have developed for on-site management.
So thank you, Jo. So the next task, task 2, site visit and discussions, included a visit to the project area and direct discussion with project affected people. Now here we can see a map which depicts land boundaries in yellow, and you can see that the land boundaries are orientated, if you like, towards the northeast, southwest. And then through the middle of this area where we have the land boundaries, we can see the path of the overhead transmission line. Now, there's a buffer zone that's been established either side of the overhead transmission line, and where there are green circles, such as here, and you can see one here as well, the green circles reflect the location of the pylons. And during the environmental and social assessment undertaken by EBRD's consultants, one of the things that became apparent is that the landowners were very unhappy with the location of the pylons. And that was simply because if you look, for example, at this location here, you can see that the pylon is located towards the center of the land boundary and the land parcel, which is here. This one as well is located pretty much towards the center of the land boundary. And this one is located to the edge. Now, the land boundaries are a reflection of historical processes that have been undertaken to chop up the land into individual and smaller areas. But what the farmers were concerned about is that if they have a pylon towards the center of their land, it would create an obstacle for them to farm the land. And instead what they wanted to see was, for example, like this, which I think is random, is the pylon being located towards the edge of a land parcel. And so the farmers were quite upset. And what that reflected at a broader level is that during the project's design, there hadn't really been enough engagement with the project affected people to help improve the design of the project and to adopt what we call the mitigation hierarchy, which is to avoid the impact if possible, and if not, then minimize the impact. And so one of the key findings of this environmental and social assessment undertaken was to explore the way in which the location of the pylons could be shifted slightly so that they are towards the edge of the land boundaries. Let's now move on to the issues associated with livestock herders. Now, a variety of livestock herders use the project area. They use the area for grazing with their animals, as you can see here in the photo. Now, the livestock herders were not aware of how the project could affect them. For example, there was going to be the installation of fences during construction, restricting access to certain locations of the project area, where the access roads are to be upgraded or where the turbines are to be installed. And the herders were not aware of those access restrictions that would take place in the future. They were also not aware of the entitlement to livelihood restoration measures. And following the review of the environmental and social impact assessment during task 1, it also became clear that the impact to the livelihoods of the livestock herders had not really been assessed in adequate detail. There were, for example, no communications protocols established between the client and these informal land users to inform them of when the future access restrictions would take place. And when the project was discussed with them during the site visit, and the locations of the access road and the fences surrounding the access road that would be present was disclosed, what they requested was regular crossing points. Now, the location of the crossing points along the areas where temporary fences would be installed should have been agreed with them in consultation with the herders. And it also became clear that essentially there were just not enough resources on the client's team to manage the issues at a local level, and at least 3 community liaison officers were needed. The project had a reasonable level of staffing within the client's office, but the client was based in the capital city, which was far from the project site, and they didn't have enough personnel active at a site or a project level. And that was one of the key recommendations from the site visit, is that there needed to be some community liaison officers. So Joe, moving on to the PR6 issues, please take us through some of the key findings from Task 2.
Obviously, when we conduct a site visit and look at a project like this, one of our main objectives is to ensure that good international practice is being followed. And actually PR6 specifies that good international practice should be followed where there are potential impacts on priority biodiversity or critical habitat. In this case, the client was well aware of the sensitivity of the location for birds and bats in general, and had conducted some studies to look at which species were present, and then subsequently done some modelling to look at what those impacts might be and how significant. But let's think a little bit about the avoidance step of the mitigation hierarchy. In the case of wind farms, avoidance is absolutely critical, because once a project is located in a sensitive location, it isn't always possible to remove or mitigate the impacts. So all the good international practice guidance on wind farms states that sensitive locations should be avoided. And those locations include known habitats for sensitive species, or locations between such areas where you might have birds flying between a foraging area and a good breeding area, for example, or where you might have bats foraging within the vicinity of a nursery roost. So also designated or recognised areas of importance for biodiversity should be avoided where such sensitive species are present. This might be an important bird area, or again an area around a known roost for a species of conservation importance. And you can see that both of those things apply actually in this project. Another thing to avoid would be known migration rates or movement corridors where overhead power lines or the turbines themselves might represent a risk or a barrier, which could interrupt migration or perhaps cause mortality. Also, in the case of this project, you will note that the turbines are actually located on a mountain ridge or high up a mountain, which can be an issue where you have migratory birds flying over, especially where there's a known flight path. So actually this project ticks several of these boxes and therefore is located in a highly sensitive location, which potentially should have been avoided. However, given the sensitivity of the location, it's absolutely essential that a detailed collision risk model is developed. And that was done in this case based on a certain amount of baseline information. And we'll look at that in the next slide. Another thing to remember is that it's not just the location that's important. It may also be that construction, for example, should avoid sensitive times of the year. So if there's a risk during construction that's quite specific to migratory species, constructing out of the migration period could avoid the impact altogether. The same applies where rare bird species are nesting. it may be possible to construct the project out of the bird breeding season and thereby avoid impacts at source, which is always the best approach. Another thing to consider is whether temporal constraints on construction could avoid impact on nocturnal species. So many bat species are nocturnal and are very significantly affected by night working. So there may be several ways to avoid impacts, even if the project is in an intrinsically sensitive location. So just looking briefly at the kind of modelling a project might do and that one might expect where you have a wind farm in a sensitive location. Such a model should look at resident species and also migratory species. So in other words, get good coverage all year round of any sensitive species that might occur. And the model should use data collected at an appropriate time. So if you do have risks to breeding birds or migratory birds, it's very important that you also collect baseline data when those target species are likely to be present.
Yes, that's right, Joe. It's really important that the field-based baseline surveys are completed at certain seasons, depending upon the nature of identified habitats and the potential species. So this should include, for example, adequate coverage of nesting season and also migratory seasons as well. Yeah, please carry on.
In this case, the project did quite a comprehensive baseline data collection for the purposes of the collision risk model, with data collected at regular periods from several observation points over a 12-month period. So that's good practice. They also looked at risks to both birds and bats, and they took account of the different types of species present and how that would affect the level of risk. And they also did validity checks. So in this case, quite good modelling was done for the risk of collision from the turbines based on a good data collection process. One thing that's very important to consider, however, is whether the project has been considered in its entirety. And it's quite common for biodiversity impacts for the spatial scope of biodiversity baseline surveys and other studies to be too restricted to the focal project itself. And in this case, you can see that as well as the mitigation measures needed directly for the wind farm itself, it might also be necessary to consider mitigation needed for ancillary infrastructure and the access roads. And we'll consider those kinds of measures in subsequent slides. But here, what we expected to see was that the collision risk model would be used to look at mortality of species and likely numbers and how that would translate into outcomes for the population that would be affected. So in other words, will a significant proportion of the population be affected? And therefore, is it necessary to do some specific mitigation to limit those impacts if they can't be avoided? So in this case, it's quite clear that there would be potential risks to birds associated with the IBA and also to some bats that nest in the caves. And therefore, we do have impacts on sensitive species and we need to do something to limit those impacts. We also have to look at behavioural disruption and local loss of habitat where there are pylons or concrete pads that the turbines are placed on. So having looked at whether it's possible to adjust micro locations of turbines to avoid sensitive locations for plants or perhaps roosting caves, the other methods that represent good international practice are to use surveillance methodology. This might be human observers or it might be artificial techniques to know when sensitive species might be present and to have automatic shutdown mechanisms in turbines that allow risk of collision to be reduced. And this is becoming much more common, and there are some very elaborate techniques available that can be considered. Some of these use acoustic deterrents for bats, others adjust the colour or coatings on the turbines, and Low-level ultraviolet lighting has also been used to deter bats so that they avoid coming into collision with the turbine. Another option is to actually shut turbines down completely when sensitive species approach, and there may be predefined wind speeds at which that kicks in so that fatalities can be reduced. It's also possible to feather turbine wind vanes so that they're less damaging, or to allow freewheeling mechanisms that again have less impact when an animal collides. So in a good project, using modern techniques and based on of which species might be at risk, it's possible to combine detection mechanisms with avoidance systems that kick in when those species are present. And for a project in a location as sensitive as this one, where there's a risk to critical habitat and important bird areas, we would expect to see these kind of measures being used. Other measures we might consider where the location is sensitive like this is to employ an ecologist to actually supervise construction and to make sure that no wildlife get entrapped when construction occurs, for example, in excavation areas that aren't fenced. We also noted in this case that the consultants for the client had recommended measures like not leaving food waste out that might attract birds and put them at risk, and also controlling hunting. And one of the reasons for this in this project was that Herman's tortoise actually occurred in the area. And although this wasn't initially identified as a specific risk from the wind farm itself, they could potentially be affected by development of the access road. And it was recognised that some measures would need to be put in place to stop collection of Herman's tortoises for the pet trade, which they're very popular for. Herman's tortoise is actually an endangered species on the IUCN Red List. And although some measures had been put in for the species itself, the critical habitat assessment hadn't properly included it or considered it. So that would be one of the recommendations that we made. There were also potential impacts to sensitive plants, and so specific measures were needed to make sure that plant communities were avoided that included nationally red listed species, and also that detailed restoration methods were possible where there were any impacts on those plant communities. The sensitivity of the location meant it was very important that bird and bat monitoring should take place, and that the results of that monitoring should be used to adjust operational management controls in future. So that might mean that cut-off speeds for turbines might need to be adjusted and things like that. So definitely quite detailed bird and bat monitoring would be necessary. We'll also come on to this, but the overhead power lines for the project that take the power from the wind farm to the national grid could also represent a barrier to bird species, and therefore it would be necessary to monitor those power lines for collisions. And we would also request that the client consider the need for bird flight diverters and other mechanisms that we'll consider in the next slide. So, as I mentioned earlier, it's very important that the biodiversity assessments done for the project consider all the components of the project in adequate detail. And in this case, there are quite significant changes to access roads, which were previously local dirt roads and are going to be hard paved and also used by public traffic. So the volume of traffic could increase quite considerably. And as well as physical disturbance and footprint, there could also be impacts during construction on the nationally protected plants that we mentioned earlier, from dust deposition and that kind of impact. But of most concern probably is the impact of roads on Herman's tortoise, which isn't a hugely mobile species and is very vulnerable to barrier and collision effects, as well as entrapment in construction areas and disturbance generally, as well as the collection and hunting we mentioned earlier. So really in this case, we would have expected a much more detailed study done of this species and a really detailed mitigation strategy presented in a biodiversity action plan. And that wasn't in place when we conducted the review for this project, so we would have asked for it to be done as a matter of urgency. The project had looked at salvaging and translocating sensitive vegetation that was affected by the development of the access roads and that upgrade. And it's important to note here that one should always question the effectiveness of measures such as translocation. If you look at conservation evidence, it's actually quite common for translocation to fail. So where translocation is recommended by a project, it's very important to check that there are good chances of success. And again, you would expect quite a detailed plan to explain what methods would be used, how vegetation or plants would be moved, and what specifically would be done to identify suitable locations to put them, and what follow-up management would be needed. For the tortoise, we would expect quite close supervision by a specialist during construction, and specific measures to be used to prevent entrapment or to ensure that any tortoises that did become trapped could be actually rescued and removed to a suitable location. And it might be that the design of the access roads should have included road crossing structures for tortoises, or that those might need to be retrofitted in future. So this is something we would discuss in detail during the site visit, hopefully with a specialist ecologist on site. We've already mentioned that the overhead transmission line for the project could represent a collision risk for certain birds. And some of these are known to nest in the area of the project. So as well as the direct effects of the concrete pads that are needed to support the pylons for the overhead power line, we would also need to consider disturbance and whether a temporal constraint on construction might be needed during the breeding seasons for nesting birds or Hermann's tortoise. We would hope that in a project like this, a detailed review of the route of the overhead transmission line were done so that it could be aligned to minimise collision risks for birds, and also that the timing of construction would be adjusted as necessary. Good international practice can include burying of power lines, if this is technically feasible, in really sensitive locations such as migratory bottlenecks, but it's very expensive to do this, and clients are usually very reluctant to do so unless there's an overriding conservation need. That would be something to discuss in detail, however, given the specific risks identified in critical habitat assessment. Measures can be used, such as bird flight diverters, which help to enhance the visibility of lines so that birds can see them and don't collide with them. But in a montane location with potentially night-flying species, such measures are less effective. It's also possible to adjust the design of power lines, for example, by using horizontal arrays, and again, that can help to minimise collision risk. And finally, good international practice nowadays is to install insulation to stop electrocution of birds that perch on power lines, and there's very well documented experience of how effective that can be. We would expect all these measures to be clearly documented following the mitigation hierarchy and clearly expressed in a biodiversity action plan for the project. When audits are done, sometimes the state of development of biodiversity action plans varies, and it can be that a full plan isn't available when site visits are conducted, but they're absolutely essential to be in place before construction starts.
Thank you, Joe. So on to task 3, analysis and reporting using the EBRD format. So the purpose of task 3 is to take all of the information gathered from task 1 and 2 and to analyse that to understand and identify what future actions should be included into the environmental and social action plan. And so let's now take a brief look at what the ESAP inclusions were for PR5. So firstly, there was no assessment of how the client has avoided or minimised land-related impacts in accordance with the mitigation hierarchy. The project design needed to be reassessed and optimised to reflect the type and locations of social receptors. The ESIA did not include an adequate description of land users or the impact of restricting access to mountain springs to the grazers. There was in general an over-reliance on the use of Google Earth to identify social receptors and understand land use patterns. Additional stakeholder engagement was required to optimise the design and the location of the transmission line pylons with project-affected people, reflecting land boundaries. A livelihood restoration plan was required, which should contain a criteria of who will be entitled to the livelihood restoration measures. And finally, the client needed to recruit up to 3 community liaison officers, and their role will be to inform land users about the project, the locations where access restrictions will occur during construction, to agree and discuss the location of the crossing points along sections where road construction is ongoing, provide information on local employment opportunities, raising awareness of the grievance mechanism, and also broadly the community development initiatives that were to be undertaken by the client. And then also looking into operations, their role is also to inform land users about the future land-related impacts that will occur, such as the generation of shadow flicker and noise and ice throw, which is a community health and safety issue. And also to inform land users that areas in between the turbines can still be used for grazing and other purposes, in that the construction fences that are to be installed are temporary and will be taken away. And in fact, the broader project area can still be used for grazing of livestock. It's just a small area that will be restricted, which essentially surrounds the individual turbine foundations. So Joe, please take us through the gaps identified for inclusion in the Environmental and Social Action Plan for PR6.
Thanks, Stuart. So in this case, although a fair amount of biodiversity baseline work had been done and quite a good collision risk model, there wasn't a comprehensive assessment that would allow us to know exactly which priority biodiversity features could be affected and whether or not there definitely was critical habitat affected by the project. So we would have expected the baseline to have provided the information needed to conduct a critical habitat assessment. In fact, the baseline scope was not really commensurate with the scale and magnitude of the likely project impacts or the sensitivity of the location from a biodiversity perspective, and it didn't fully cover the entire spatial footprint of the project or the areas where indirect effects could be anticipated. In order to get a comprehensive baseline, there was much too much reliance on pre-construction surveys, which are typically conducted far too late for any real design changes to be possible. This means that only damage limitation measures can be considered. In fact, there could have been quite significant impacts that needed to be avoided, particularly in relation to Herman's tortoise, which didn't have sufficient assessment. This means that we would be requesting supplementary studies for the baseline and also completion of a critical habitat assessment for the project. In fact, there hadn't really been adequate consultation with nature conservation authorities or specialists regarding the potential impacts of the project on the important bird area. And this is something we would have tried to follow up during the site visit, but would certainly request as a follow-up from the site visit. Another aspect really not considered in sufficient detail or in really any comprehensive method at all was the ecosystem service impacts of the project. So we would be requesting that an ecosystem services review were done hopefully in collaboration with the social team of the client or their consultants, so that any implications for ecosystem services that might be considered a priority would be assessed properly. We weren't able to find a detailed reinstatement plan for vegetation or areas disturbed during construction, and this is something we would have expected to see because of the presence of nationally protected plants. I've already mentioned the critical habitat assessment, but this is absolutely essential before construction occurs, or in fact before any significant land disturbance occurs. And it should be used as the basis for a biodiversity action plan, which should set out the detailed measures needed to ensure net gain in critical habitat and a satisfactory outcome for priority biodiversity features affected by the project. In other words, what measures will be taken to maintain populations of priority species or to achieve enhancement in critical habitat. The ESIA also failed to consider in any depth the possibility that invasive species might be introduced to the area or that they could spread as a consequence of the project. So this is another requirement that should be considered and appropriate measures included in the BAP if necessary.
Thank you, Jo. And so before we close, let's now just take a final look at the applicability of the PRs to this example. And as we see, all of the PRs apply with the exception of PR7. We have in this example gone into some detail in relation to PR6, but you can see that there are extensive assessment requirements from the remaining PRs that apply. And so that finishes this video 1 on power generation. Thank you very much, and I hope you've enjoyed learning about this industry sector.